Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. My mom had barely pulled out of the driveway when I started thinking about that frozen lasagna in the freezer. It was a Saturday afternoon in early March, the kind of gray day where the clouds hang so low you feel like you could reach up and touch them. She left me alone for the first time in months, trusting me to handle a few hours by myself while she drove to pick up my grandmother from the airport 2 hours away. At 13, having graduated middle school the previous spring, and now navigating my first year of high school, I felt ready to prove I could be responsible. Our house sat at the end of Birchwood Lane in a quiet suburb outside of Detroit, a 2-story colonial with peeling blue paint and a kitchen that hadn't been updated since the 80s. My dad had moved out the year before and money was tight, which explained why half our appliances were held together with duct tape and prayers. The microwave was one of them. I knew that microwave had problems. We all did. It had started sparking about 6 weeks earlier, little flashes of blue light that crackled behind the glass door whenever you heated something for more than 2 minutes. My mom kept saying she would replace it, kept promising that next paycheck would be the one, but something always came up. The car needed new brakes. The furnace filter had to be changed. Life kept demanding its pound of flesh, and the microwave stayed on that cracked laminate counter, humming and sparking like a ticking time bomb none of us wanted to acknowledge. She had told me 100 times to use the oven instead, to be patient and wait the extra 20 minutes for things to heat up properly. But that afternoon, standing in the kitchen with my stomach growling and 6 hours of video games calling my name, patience felt like a foreign concept. The oven seemed so slow, so unnecessary, when the microwave was right there, ready to give me hot food in 5 minutes flat. I pulled the lasagna from the freezer, a family-sized tray wrapped in plastic with instructions printed in tiny blue letters on the cardboard sleeve. The oven directions said to preheat to 375 degrees, remove the plastic film, and bake for 45 minutes. 45 minutes. That was almost an hour of my life wasted waiting for food when I could be upstairs in my room, controller in hand, grinding through the new campaign my friend Brett had been raving about all week. The microwave instructions were simpler, more appealing. Puncture the film, heat on high for 8 minutes, let stand for 2. I stood there in the kitchen, holding that frozen tray, having a silent argument with myself that lasted maybe 30 seconds. I thought about the sparks, about my mom's voice telling me to be careful, about all the reasons this was a bad idea. Then I thought about how hungry I was, how the sparks never actually did anything, how I had used the microwave dozens of times since it started acting up, and nothing bad had ever happened. The plastic film made a satisfying pop when I punctured it with a fork. I slid the tray onto the microwave's glass turntable and punched in 8 minutes, watching the green numbers glow against the beige plastic casing. For the first minute or so, everything seemed normal. The turntable rotated slowly, the fan hummed, and I could see the frost on the lasagna starting to melt into little puddles on the surface. I leaned against the counter and pulled out my phone, scrolling through messages from Brett about strategy tips for the game. I was reading something about a secret weapon location when I heard the first crackle. It was louder than usual, a sharp snap that made me look up from my screen. Through the microwave door, I saw a flash of blue light near the back corner, right where the magnetron sat behind the inner wall. I should have stopped it right then. I should have hit cancel and accepted that the universe was telling me something. Instead, I just watched, telling myself it would be fine. It was always fine. The second crackle came with a sound I had never heard before. A wet, sizzling pop like bacon hitting a hot pan. A ribbon of orange flame curled up from somewhere behind the turntable, licking at the plastic film covering my lasagna. For a moment I just stared at it, my brain refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. Fire. There was actual fire inside the microwave. The flame grew brighter, feeding on the melting plastic, and suddenly thick black smoke began pouring out from the gaps around the door. The smell hit me next, acrid and chemical, burning the inside of my nose and making my eyes water instantly. I lunged forward and jabbed the cancel button, but the damage was already done. When I yanked open the door, a wave of heat slammed into my face and I stumbled backward as flames jumped from the ruined lasagna tray onto the paper towel roll my mom kept next to the microwave. Within seconds, that entire roll was a torch, flames racing up toward the wooden cabinets above the counter. Panic is a strange thing. It shuts down the logical part of your brain and leaves you operating on pure instinct, which sounds useful until you realize your instincts are terrible. My first thought was not to call 911. My first thought was not to run outside and get help from the neighbors. My first thought, the one that consumed every fiber of my being in that moment, was that my mom was going to kill me. She trusted me. She left me alone for the first time in forever, and within an hour I had set the kitchen on fire using the one appliance she specifically told me not to use. I could not let her find out. I could not let anyone find out. So instead of doing any of the smart things, the things they taught us in school during Fire Safety Week, I grabbed a dish towel from the drawer and started swatting at the flames like I was trying to kill a wasp. The towel caught fire almost immediately, and I dropped it with a yelp, watching it land on the linoleum floor where it began to scorch a black mark into the faded yellow surface. Water. I needed water. I spun around and grabbed the biggest pot I could find from the cabinet next to the stove, a heavy stainless steel thing my mom used for making spaghetti. I shoved it under the faucet and cranked the handle all the way, watching the water fill the pot with agonizing slowness, while behind me the fire crackled and grew. The cabinets were fully engulfed now, old dry wood that had been soaking up cooking grease for decades, and the flames were spreading across the ceiling in a rolling wave of orange and black. The smoke detector finally woke up, screaming its high-pitched alarm that drilled into my skull like a dentist's tool. I hauled the pot out of the sink, water sloshing over the sides and soaking my socks, and I threw it at the base of the flames with all the strength I had. The water hit the fire with a hiss and a cloud of steam, but it barely made a dent. The flames just flickered for a second, and then roared back to life, angrier than before, as if I had insulted them by trying something so pathetic. I filled the pot again, and again and again. Each time I threw water at the fire, and each time it seemed to do absolutely nothing. The kitchen was filling with smoke now, thick gray clouds that hung at eye level and made it impossible to breathe without coughing. My lungs burned, my eyes streamed with tears. I could barely see the sink anymore, just fumbled for the faucet by memory while the world around me dissolved into chaos. The heat was incredible, pressing against my skin like I was standing too close to a bonfire, and I could feel the hair on my arms starting to singe. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice was screaming at me to get out, to run, to save myself, but I kept fighting. I kept thinking that if I could just put out the fire, everything would be okay. I could clean up the mess, open the windows, and my mom would never have to know. That delusion kept me rooted in place while the fire consumed my kitchen inch by inch. The window above the sink shattered from the heat, and that was the moment everything changed. Cold March air rushed in, and instead of helping, it fed the flames like oxygen to a dying ember. The fire exploded outward, climbing the walls with renewed fury, and I finally understood that I was going to die in this kitchen if I did not move right now. I dropped the pot and ran for the back door, slamming my hip against the kitchen table hard enough to leave a bruise that would last for weeks. My fingers fumbled with the deadbolt, slick with sweat and shaking so badly I could barely grip the metal. Behind me I heard something crash, the cabinets collapsing maybe, or the ceiling starting to give way. I did not look back. I just wrenched open the door and threw myself into the backyard, stumbling down the wooden steps and collapsing onto the frozen grass. The cold hit me like a slap, shocking after the inferno I had just escaped, and I lay there gasping and coughing up black mucus while smoke poured out of my house in thick dark columns that rose toward the gray sky. I do not know how long I lay there before I heard the screaming. It might have been seconds, might have been a minute, but suddenly there was a voice cutting through the roar of the fire and the ringing in my ears. It was Mr. Callahan from next door, a retired firefighter who spent most of his days tending to his vegetable garden and yelling at kids who cut across his lawn. He came running around the side of the house, his face pale and his eyes wide, wearing a flannel bathrobe and slippers like he had just been watching television when the world caught fire. He grabbed me by the shoulders and hauled me to my feet, shouting questions I could barely process. Was anyone else inside? Was I hurt? What happened? I tried to answer, tried to form words, but all that came out was a rasping cough and a sob that tore itself from somewhere deep in my chest. He half carried me across the yard, away from the house, and deposited me on the sidewalk before sprinting back toward his own home, shouting something about calling 911 and checking on the Delgados on the other side. The fire trucks arrived 7 minutes later, though it felt like hours. By then, the entire first floor of our house was engulfed, flames shooting out of the kitchen windows and licking up toward the second story where my bedroom was. I sat on the curb wrapped in a scratchy wool blanket that someone had draped over my shoulders, watching firefighters in heavy gear drag hoses across our front lawn and spray thousands of gallons of water at a house that used to be my home. The Delgados stood in their driveway, a young couple with a baby who had moved in just 6 months earlier, watching with horror as embers drifted toward their roof and firefighters scrambled to wet down their siding to keep the fire from spreading. I saw the wife clutching their infant daughter against her chest, tears streaming down her face, and something inside me cracked wide open. That baby could have died. Those people could have lost everything. Because I wanted to save 40 minutes on a frozen lasagna. Because I was too impatient, too stupid, too desperate to hide my mistake to do the right thing and call for help when I still had the chance. My mom arrived just as the firefighters were declaring the blaze under control. She came tearing down Birchwood Lane in her old Subaru, my grandmother in the passenger seat looking terrified, and before the car had even fully stopped, she was out of the driver's seat and running toward me. I expected anger. I expected screaming. I expected her to demand to know what I had done, to shake me and ask me how I could be so stupid. Instead, she just dropped to her knees on the wet pavement and pulled me into her arms so tight I could barely breathe, sobbing into my smoke-stained hair while she repeated over and over that I was okay, that I was alive, that nothing else mattered. I broke down completely then, confessing everything between gasping sobs, the microwave, the sparks, the lasagna, my pathetic attempts to put out the fire instead of calling for help. She just held me tighter and told me we would figure it out, that we would get through this together, that houses could be rebuilt but I could not be replaced. That made me cry even harder, because I knew I did not deserve that kind of grace. We lost almost everything that day. The fire gutted the entire first floor and caused so much smoke and water damage to the second floor that most of our belongings were unsalvageable. My mom's wedding photos, gone. My grandmother's quilt that had been in the family for 4 generations, gone. All my video games, my clothes, my books, every physical reminder of my childhood, gone. Insurance covered some of it, but not nearly enough, and we spent the next 8 months living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment while the house was rebuilt. My dad, who had barely spoken to us since the divorce, actually showed up to help. He took time off work to sort through the wreckage with my mom, salvaging what little could be saved, and for a while it almost felt like we were a family again. The Delgados forgave me eventually. Their house survived with only minor damage to the siding, and the wife, her name was Rosa, I learned later, brought us casseroles every week while we were in that apartment. I could barely look her in the eye for months, but she never once made me feel like the monster I knew I was. That was 11 years ago. I am 24 now, working as an electrician of all things, and I think about that day more often than I would like to admit. I still cannot use a microwave without checking it obsessively, without standing right there watching through the glass door for any sign of trouble. The smell of burning plastic makes me nauseous. Smoke alarms send me into a spiral of anxiety that takes hours to shake. But here's the thing I learned from that day, the lesson that burned itself into my brain, along with all those other scars. Asking for help is not weakness. Admitting you made a mistake is not failure. The real failure is letting pride and fear turn a small problem into a catastrophe. If I had just called 911 when the fire started, when it was still contained to the microwave, they could have been there in minutes. The damage would have been minimal. Nobody would have been in danger. Instead, I let my terror of getting in trouble almost kill me and the family next door. I share this story now because I want other kids, other peoples to understand that no mistake is worth dying over. No punishment is worse than what could happen if you try to hide a fire. When things go wrong, swallow your pride and ask for help. It might just save your life. Anyone who has taken a Greyhound at 2 in the morning knows the particular kind of loneliness that settles into your bones when the highway stretches out like a black ribbon under fluorescent rest stop lights. November 2012 found me making that exact trip from Philadelphia to somewhere in upstate New York, chasing a job interview that promised a fresh start after my engagement fell apart 3 months before what should have been my wedding day. My graduating class from college had already moved on to mortgages and babies, and there I was, 26 according to my driver's license but feeling ancient, dragging a single suitcase and a heart full of desperate optimism onto a half-empty bus that smelled like diesel and someone's leftover fast food. The driver barely glanced at my ticket before waving me toward the back, where the overhead lights flickered with that sickly yellow glow that makes everyone look like they are recovering from something terrible. I picked a window seat about halfway down, pressed my forehead against the cold glass, and watched the Philadelphia skyline shrink into a smear of lights behind us. She got on at the Harrisburg stop, right around 3:30 in the morning when my eyelids had started to grow heavy, and the handful of other passengers had already surrendered to uncomfortable sleep. I noticed her immediately because she moved with this deliberate slowness, like someone who had all the time in the world and wanted you to know it. She was maybe 60, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, and these pale blue eyes that seemed almost colorless under the dim bus lights. She wore a hand-knitted cardigan the color of dried roses and carried a large woven basket covered with a checkered cloth, the kind you see in old paintings of country picnics. When she stopped at my row and smiled down at me, I automatically pulled my bag from the empty seat beside me, the way you do when you are raised to be polite, even when every part of you just wants to be left alone. She settled in next to me with a soft sigh, arranging her basket on her lap with careful, almost ceremonial movements, and turned to face me with a warmth that felt rehearsed somehow, like she had practiced that exact smile in a mirror until it looked natural enough. Her name was Dorothy, she told me within the first 5 minutes, and she was heading to visit her grandson in Syracuse for his birthday. She asked me questions with this gentle persistence that made it hard to give short answers. Where was I going? What did I do for work? Did I have family waiting for me at the other end? I found myself telling her about the job interview, about the marketing position at a small firm that had seemed like a lifeline, when the email arrived in my inbox 2 weeks ago. She listened with her head tilted slightly to one side, making these small humming sounds of acknowledgement that grandmothers make when they want you to know they are paying attention. There was something almost hypnotic about talking to her in that dark bus, with the engine rumbling beneath us and the occasional flash of headlights from passing trucks illuminating her pale features. She patted my hand at one point and told me I seemed like a lovely young woman, that good things were surely coming my way, and I remember feeling this strange mixture of comfort and unease, like when a stranger stands just a little too close to you in an elevator. About an hour into our conversation, Dorothy lifted the checkered cloth from her basket and revealed rows of small pastries wrapped in wax paper, each one golden brown and glistening with what looked like honey glaze. She told me she had baked them for her grandson but had made far too many, that her eyes were always bigger than her kitchen could handle, and she laughed at her own joke with this tinkling sound that seemed too delicate for her age. She pressed one of the pastries into my hand before I could refuse, insisting that I looked hungry, that a young woman traveling alone at this hour needed something sweet to keep her spirits up. The pastry was still slightly warm somehow, which should have struck me as strange given that she had boarded the bus over an hour ago. But my stomach growled at the sight of it, and my brain was foggy from exhaustion. I took a bite to be polite, and the taste flooded my mouth. Honey and almonds and something else underneath, something floral and bitter that I could not quite identify. Dorothy watched me chew with an intensity that lasted just a second too long, before her face relaxed back into that practiced grandmotherly warmth, and she told me to finish it all, that I needed my strength for my big interview. The first wave hit me about 20 minutes later, this soft heaviness that started behind my eyes and slowly poured down through my skull like warm syrup. I thought it was just exhaustion finally catching up to me, the accumulated weight of sleepless nights spent crying over wedding deposits I would never get back, and apartments I could no longer afford on my own. My limbs began to feel distant, like they belonged to someone else and I was just borrowing them for the night. The window glass against my temple seemed to pulse with the vibration of the bus, and the passing lights on the highway started leaving long trails across my vision, streaking like comets in slow motion. I tried to sit up straighter, to shake off whatever was pulling me under, but my body refused to cooperate with the simple command. Dorothy's voice reached me through what felt like layers of cotton, asking if I was feeling all right, if perhaps I should rest my eyes for a little while. Her hand found my shoulder and guided me gently down until my head was resting against the seat back, and the last thing I saw clearly was her face hovering above me, that smile still fixed in place but her eyes now sharp and attentive, watching me the way a cat watches a bird with a broken wing. I do not know how long I drifted in that strange half-sleep, that place where you are aware of the world around you but cannot quite reach it. Sounds came to me distorted and fragmented, the rumble of the engine, the occasional cough from somewhere behind us, and beneath it all, a low murmuring that I slowly realized was Dorothy's voice. She was no longer speaking to me. I forced my eyes open just a crack, just enough to see through my lashes without alerting her that I was conscious, and I saw her leaning forward toward the aisle, her lips moving close to someone's ear. The driver. He had left his seat at some point. The bus must have stopped, though I had no memory of it, and he was crouched in the aisle beside Dorothy, his head bent toward hers like they were sharing secrets at a church social. I caught fragments of words, pieces of a conversation that made no sense to my drugged mind. The one, perfect age, service road past exit 47. The driver nodded once, twice, and then his eyes flicked toward me, just for a second, and in that moment I saw something that burned through the fog in my brain. He was not checking if I was comfortable, he was checking if I was unconscious enough. Panic is a strange thing when your body will not let you express it. My heart hammered against my ribs. I could feel it pounding like a fist trying to break through a locked door, but outwardly I remained still, limp, my breathing slow and shallow. The driver returned to his seat, and the bus lurched forward again, but something had changed. The smooth rhythm of the highway was gone, replaced by rougher roads, the occasional bump that made my head loll against the seat in a way that would have been painful if I could feel pain properly anymore. Through the window I could see that the lights had disappeared. No more passing trucks or distant farmhouses, just darkness pressing against the glass like a living thing. Dorothy hummed softly beside me, this tuneless melody that might have been a lullaby in another context, but here, in this moment, sounded like something you would hear in a nightmare you cannot wake from. I tried to move my fingers, just a twitch, just something to prove to myself that I still existed inside this useless body, and after what felt like an eternity I managed to curl my pinky finger against my palm. It was not much, but it was enough to tell me the drug was not as strong as they thought, or maybe I had not eaten enough of that pastry. Or maybe pure terror was burning through the chemicals faster than they expected. The bus slowed and turned again, gravel crunching beneath the tires now, and I risked opening my eyes just a fraction wider. We were on some kind of service road, the pavement cracked and neglected, weeds pushing through the asphalt on either side. Up ahead, I could see a structure taking shape in the darkness, A building, low and sprawling, that might have been a warehouse or an old processing plant. The kind of place that dots the rural stretches between major cities like forgotten teeth in a rotting mouth. There were no lights in the windows, but I could make out vehicles parked near the entrance, 3 or 4 of them, and figures moving in the shadows near a loading dock. Dorothy shifted beside me and I let my eyes fall closed again, keeping my breathing steady, even as every instinct screamed at me to run, to fight, to do something. She leaned close to my ear and whispered that we were almost there, that everything was going to be fine, that I was going to meet some very nice people who had been waiting for someone just like me. Her breath smelled like peppermint and something sour underneath, and I realized with horrible clarity that she had done this before, probably dozens of times, riding buses through the night and selecting women who traveled alone, women who no one would miss until it was far too late. The bus groaned to a stop and the engine cut off, leaving behind a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. Dorothy stood up, smoothing her cardigan with those careful hands, and called out something to the driver about helping her with the package. That word, package, hit me like ice water, cutting through the remaining fog with brutal efficiency. I was not a passenger to her, not a person, just cargo to be delivered and forgotten. Through my barely open eyes, I watched her step into the aisle and move toward the front of the bus, her woven basket left behind on the seat like a prop that had served its purpose. The driver was already outside. I could hear his footsteps on the gravel, and then voices. Male voices, at least 2 of them, speaking in low tones that I could not make out. This was my only chance. I knew it with a certainty that came from somewhere primal, somewhere beneath thought or reason. If I let them take me off this bus, if I let them get me inside that building, I would never see daylight again. My mother would spend years wondering what happened to her daughter, filing missing person reports that would go nowhere, holding on to hope that would slowly curdle into grief. I could not let that happen. I refused to let that happen. My body moved before my mind fully committed to the plan, some desperate survival instinct overriding the chemicals still sluggish in my blood. I forced myself upright, fighting through the vertigo that threatened to pull me back down, and my hand found my purse still wedged between the seat and the wall where I had left it hours ago. The window. I turned to face it, my fingers clumsy and uncooperative as I searched for the emergency latch that I knew had to be there somewhere. Greyhound buses have them. I remembered reading that somewhere. Little red handles that release the windows in case of accidents. The voices outside were getting louder. Someone laughed, and I heard Dorothy say something about the girl being small, easy to move. My fingers found the latch and I pulled with everything I had left, which was not much, but it was enough. The window popped outward with a sound that seemed deafening in the silence, and I did not think, did not hesitate, just pushed myself through the opening head first, tumbling out into the cold November air and hitting the ground hard enough to knock the breath from my lungs. Pain exploded through my shoulder and hip, but I was already scrambling, already crawling toward the darkness at the edge of the property where the weeds grew tall and the trees began. Someone shouted behind me, a man's voice sharp with surprise and anger, and I heard footsteps pounding on gravel, multiple sets of them converging on where I had landed. But I was already in the tall grass, my hands and knees tearing through dried stalks and thorny underbrush, moving on pure adrenaline, and the desperate knowledge that stopping meant death, or something worse than death. The drug still pulled at me, made every movement feel like I was swimming through syrup. But fear is its own kind of medicine, and mine was potent enough to keep me going. I reached the tree line and forced myself to my feet, using a trunk for support, and then I ran. I ran blindly through branches that whipped my face and roots that tried to catch my ankles. Ran until my lungs burned and my legs screamed for mercy. Ran until the shouts behind me grew distant and confused, spreading out as they searched in the wrong directions. I do not know how long I ran or how far. Time had become meaningless, measured only in heartbeats and ragged breaths. But eventually, I stumbled onto a paved road, a real road with faded yellow lines down the center, and I followed it with the last reserves of strength I possessed until I saw lights ahead, a gas station glowing like a beacon in the pre-dawn darkness. The attendant was a young man named Keith. I remember that because I made him tell me 3 times before I believed he was real, before I believed any of it was real. He found me collapsed against the ice machine outside, shaking and covered in dirt and dried blood from a dozen scratches I did not remember getting. He called the police while I sat in the back office wrapped in a blanket that smelled like motor oil and cigarettes, the most beautiful smells I had ever encountered, because they meant safety. They meant survival. The officers who arrived treated me with a skepticism that slowly transformed into horror as I described what had happened, as they drove me back along the route I had stumbled and found the service road, found the warehouse. It was empty by then, of course. Dorothy and the driver and whoever had been waiting for me had vanished like smoke, leaving behind only tire tracks and a single woven basket with a checkered cloth that tested positive for traces of Rohypnol. They never caught them, any of them. The bus company had no record of a driver matching the description I gave, and Dorothy, if that was even her name, existed nowhere in any database the FBI could access. Sometimes I wonder how many women she delivered before me, how many after, how many are still out there in the dark waiting for someone to come looking. I moved back in with my mother after that, took a job at a local bookstore, rebuilt my life one small piece at a time. But I have not taken a bus since that night, and I never will again. And every time I see an older woman with a basket, with that particular kind of grandmotherly smile, I cross to the other side of the street, and I do not look back. Driving for a rideshare app was supposed to be temporary, just something to help pay off student loans, while my actual career figured itself out. By the fall of 2017, my college graduation was already 2 years behind me, and the marketing degree I had worked so hard for sat collecting dust while I spent my nights picking up drunk college kids and businessmen who needed airport runs at ungodly hours. That particular Friday night started like any other. I had logged on around 9, hoping to catch the bar crowd and maybe squeeze in a few decent fares before calling it quits around 2 in the morning. The first few hours were uneventful, mostly short trips downtown, a couple heading to a concert venue, the usual. Around midnight, I pulled into a gas station parking lot off Route 34 to grab a coffee and check my phone. The app had been slow for about 20 minutes, and I was debating whether to just head home early. That is when the ping came through, and I remember staring at it longer than I should have. The pickup location was about 15 miles outside of town, way out on Miller Road where the streetlights stopped and the farmland started. The passenger had a 4.2 rating, which was not great but not terrible either. The destination field just said gas station, which was vague enough to make me hesitate. Everything in my gut told me to decline the ride. 15 miles out meant 15 miles back with no guarantee of another fare, and that stretch of road was nothing but cornfields and the occasional farmhouse with lights that always seemed to be off. But here is the thing about driving rideshare. Your acceptance rate matters. Too many declined rides and the algorithm starts punishing you, sending you fewer requests, pushing you down some invisible list. I had already skipped 2 rides earlier that night because of bad vibes, and I could not afford another hit. So I accepted the request, finished my coffee in 3 gulps, and started driving toward the kind of darkness that makes your headlights feel inadequate. The drive out to Miller Road took about 25 minutes, and with each mile the world seemed to shrink down to just my car and whatever the headlights could reach. No other vehicles, no houses with porch lights on, just flat stretches of farmland broken up by the occasional cluster of trees that looked like black smudges against the slightly less black sky. My GPS kept telling me to continue straight, and I remember thinking how strange it was that someone would request a ride from out here. There were no bars, no restaurants, nothing that would explain why a person would be stranded in this specific spot at nearly 1 in the morning. When I finally got close to the pickup location, I saw the car first. It was a dark sedan, maybe a Nissan or a Toyota, hard to tell in the darkness, pulled off onto the gravel shoulder with its hazard lights blinking orange. A man stood next to it, illuminated by my approaching headlights, and he raised one hand in a casual wave like we were old friends meeting up for lunch. I pulled up alongside him and lowered my passenger window. He was maybe 40, 45, with a receding hairline and a face that seemed ordinary in every way, the kind of face you would forget 5 minutes after seeing it. He wore a dark jacket over a flannel shirt, jeans, work boots, nothing remarkable. He leaned down to look into my car, and when he smiled, it seemed rehearsed, like he had practiced it in a mirror until it looked natural enough. He said his name was Dennis and pointed at his car, explaining that he had hit something in the road about an hour ago and the tire went flat. No spare in the trunk, phone almost dead, so he had requested a ride to the nearest gas station to get help. It all sounded reasonable. Flat tires happen all the time. People get stranded on empty roads every single night. But something about the way he kept glancing back at his car, quick little looks like he was checking to make sure it was still there, made me wish I had trusted my earlier instinct and declined this ride when I had the chance. He climbed into the back seat and immediately I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, something metallic underneath the stronger scent of sweat and what might have been gasoline. I figured he had been messing around with his car trying to fix the tire himself, maybe cut his hand on something, got some fuel on his clothes while checking under the hood. People smell like all kinds of things, and I had learned not to judge. I confirmed the destination on my app, a gas station about 12 miles east, and started driving. For the first few minutes, Dennis did not say much. He sat behind me, not directly behind the driver's seat, but off to the right where I could see him in the rearview mirror if I adjusted it slightly. He was looking out the window at the darkness passing by, his fingers tapping an irregular rhythm on his knee. When I tried to make small talk, asking if he lived around here, he gave me a vague answer about visiting a friend who had a farm nearby. I asked which farm, and he just said I probably would not know it. About 5 minutes into the drive, Dennis leaned forward slightly and asked if we could change the destination. He said his buddy actually lived closer to Ridgewood, which was a small town about 30 miles in the opposite direction from where we were heading. He said his buddy could come pick him up from there, that it would be easier than dealing with the gas station and a tow truck at this hour. I told him that was a pretty significant change, that it would add a lot to the fare, but he waved his hand like money was not a concern. Something about the way he said it made me uneasy, this casual dismissal of cost from a guy whose car did not even have a spare tire in the trunk. But I was already out here in the middle of nowhere, and a longer fare meant more money, so I updated the destination and took the next left onto County Road 9. That road was even darker than Miller Road, if that was possible, with trees pressing in close on both sides like walls. Dennis settled back into his seat, and I caught him checking his phone, the screen lighting up his face in brief flashes. He was not texting anyone. He was looking at a map. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind kept circling back to small details that did not add up. If his phone was almost dead like he had claimed, why was he using it to look at maps instead of conserving battery? Why change the destination so drastically after I had already started driving? And that smell, that faint copper undertone that I kept catching whenever he shifted in his seat, it was not going away. I adjusted my rearview mirror a few degrees, trying to get a better look at him without being obvious. That is when I noticed his hands. In the glow from a passing farm light, just a quick flash of illumination through the window, I saw that his knuckles were dark with something. It could have been grease, could have been dirt, could have been 100 things, but it did not look like grease. It looked wet. Dennis caught me looking in the mirror and our eyes met for just a second. He smiled that same rehearsed smile and asked if everything was okay. I told him I was just checking for deer, that they like to jump out on roads like this. He nodded slowly and said that was smart, that a deer could really mess up your night. We drove in silence for another 10 minutes, and the further we got from the main road, the more my chest tightened with a feeling I could not name. Then my phone buzzed with a news alert, and I glanced down at the screen without thinking. Local stations had been pushing notifications all night about a concert and traffic delays, so I expected something routine. Instead, the headline made my foot ease off the gas pedal involuntarily. It said police were responding to a domestic disturbance on Franklin Farm Road, which was maybe 3 miles from where I had picked up Dennis. The article preview mentioned that a woman had called 911, but the call had been disconnected, and when officers arrived, they found signs of a struggle. No suspects, no additional details, investigation ongoing. I looked back up at the road, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. Franklin Farm Road. Dennis had said he was visiting a friend on a farm nearby. He had been vague about which one, had changed the subject when I pressed. And now he wanted me to drive him 30 miles in the opposite direction, away from that area, away from whatever had happened in that farmhouse. My mind started racing through options, none of them good. I could not just stop the car and tell him to get out, not on a dark, empty road with no witnesses and no help for miles. I could not call 911 without him hearing me, and even if I could, what would I say? That my passenger had dirty hands and smelled funny? That he changed his destination? None of it was proof of anything. For all I knew, the news alert was a coincidence, and Dennis really was just some unlucky guy with a flat tire. But I did not believe that anymore. The rational part of my brain kept trying to come up with innocent explanations, but my body had already decided something was wrong. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and I had to concentrate on keeping my breathing steady so he would not notice. I thought about my sister, about how she always told me this job was dangerous, how she worried every time I did late night shifts. I thought about how no one knew exactly where I was right now except for the app, and the app only showed our destination, not the isolated stretch of county road between here and there. Dennis spoke up suddenly, making me flinch. He asked if I could turn off the air conditioning because he was getting cold. I reached for the controls with a hand that I forced to stay steady, adjusting the temperature even though I had not even turned the AC on. It was October, and the heat was running low. He thanked me in that flat, polite voice and then asked another question, casual as anything. He wanted to know if I had been a rideshare driver for long. I told him about a year, keeping my answers short, trying not to let my voice crack. He said that was interesting, that he bet I met a lot of different people doing this job. I agreed that I did. Then he asked if I ever got scared, picking up strangers late at night in the middle of nowhere. The question hung in the air between us like smoke. I could see his face in the rearview mirror, half lit by the glow of the dashboard, and he was watching me with an expression I could not read. I told him no, that most people were just regular folks trying to get somewhere. He nodded slowly and said that was good, that fear could make people do stupid things. That is when I made my decision. About 2 miles ahead, I knew there was a 24-hour truck stop right off the highway exit, a place called Big Earl's that catered to long-haul drivers and always had at least a dozen rigs parked in its lot at any given hour. I had stopped there before for coffee on slow nights, and I remembered the bright fluorescent lights, the security cameras mounted on every corner, the constant flow of truckers coming and going. If I could get there, I would be surrounded by people and witnesses. I told Dennis I needed to stop for gas, that my tank was getting low and I did not want to risk running out on these back roads. I watched his reflection carefully as I said it, looking for any sign that he knew what I was really doing. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, just a tiny flicker of tension, but then he shrugged and said that was fine, that he was not in any particular hurry. The next 15 minutes felt like hours. Every time he moved in the back seat, every time he cleared his throat or shifted his weight, I expected something terrible to happen. I kept both hands on the wheel and my eyes fixed on the road ahead, counting down the miles in my head like a prayer. When the lights of Big Earl's finally appeared through the trees, I almost cried with relief. I pulled into the lot and parked right next to the entrance, under the brightest light I could find, surrounded by at least 8 or 9 parked trucks. I told Dennis I would just be a minute and got out of the car before he could respond, walking quickly toward the building without looking back. Inside, I went straight to the counter and asked the woman working there if I could use their phone. Said mine had died. She gave me a strange look but handed over the store phone and I called 911. I told them everything. The pickup location near Franklin Farm Road, the news alert about the disturbance, the stains on his hands, the change in destination, all of it tumbling out in a rush. The dispatcher told me to stay inside and that officers were being sent to my location. I hung up and turned around to look through the window at my car. Dennis was gone. The back seat was empty, the door hanging open. I scanned the parking lot frantically, but there was no sign of him anywhere, like he had just dissolved into the darkness between the trucks. The police arrived about 12 minutes later, 2 squad cars with their lights flashing red and blue across the wet asphalt. I gave them my statement, described Dennis in as much detail as I could remember, told them about the car with hazard lights on Miller Road. One of the officers stepped away to make a radio call, and when he came back, his expression had changed into something harder and more serious. He told me that the disturbance on Franklin Farm Road had been upgraded to something worse. A woman named Constance Pruitt, 41 years old, had been found dead in her kitchen by responding officers. Her estranged husband, Dennis Pruitt, was wanted for questioning. The officer showed me a photo on his phone, a driver's license picture, and my stomach turned when I recognized those ordinary, forgettable features. That face I had been looking at in my rearview mirror for the past hour. They found his car on Miller Road, just like I said, and in the trunk, wrapped in a plastic tarp, they found a hunting knife and a woman's purse with Constance Pruitt's ID inside. He had been using my car to escape, to put distance between himself and what he had done to his wife, and I had almost driven him all the way to freedom. They caught Dennis Pruitt 3 days later at a bus station in New Jersey, trying to buy a ticket to somewhere far away. He was convicted of second-degree murder the following spring and sentenced to 25 years. I followed the trial from a distance, reading articles online but never attending in person. I could not bring myself to sit in that courtroom and look at him again. I quit driving for the rideshare app that same week and never went back. Took a job at a warehouse that paid less but let me sleep at night. Sometimes I still think about that ride, about how close I came to being another part of his story instead of just a witness to it. I think about how I almost ignored my instincts because I was worried about my acceptance rate, about an algorithm punishing me for being cautious. And I think about Constance Pruitt, about how her last moments were spent in her own kitchen with a man she had once trusted enough to marry. I never met her, never even saw a photo beyond what appeared in the news coverage, but I carry her with me somehow. Every time I get into a car with a stranger now, whether I am the driver or the passenger, I remember that ordinary faces can hide extraordinary darkness, and that sometimes the only thing standing between you and something terrible is the decision to trust your gut when it tells you to run. Friday afternoon hit different that week, and not in a good way. Both my parents had called within 10 minutes of each other, explaining they were stuck at work until late. Dad had some emergency at the warehouse, and Mom was covering for a co-worker at the hospital who had gone home sick. It was just going to be me and my 2 siblings for dinner, and when Mom asked if I could handle making something, I jumped at the chance. 16 years old, and finally trusted with a real task. Not just heating up leftovers or making sandwiches. My younger brother Elliot, who had just turned 13 the month before, would be home from basketball practice around 5:30. My sister Quinn was already upstairs doing homework, earbuds in, completely checked out from the world. I decided right then that I was going to make something impressive. Mom's garlic chicken stir-fry, the recipe she had been teaching me over the past few weeks. I wanted to prove that I could be relied on, that I was growing up, that they could trust me with more responsibility. Our house sat on a quiet street in Flagstaff, one of those older neighborhoods where everyone had lived for decades and knew each other by name. The kitchen was small but efficient, every inch of counter space serving a purpose. Mom kept her cooking equipment organized with almost military precision. wooden spoons in the ceramic jar by the stove, knives on the magnetic strip, cutting boards stacked by size in the cabinet under the island. I pulled up the recipe on my phone and started gathering what I needed. Chicken breast from the fridge, vegetables from the crisper drawer, the big wok that hung on a hook above the stove. The rice cooker was already clean, sitting there waiting. Everything felt manageable, even easy. I remember tying on the old apron that hung by the pantry door, the green one with the coffee stains that Dad always joked made it look vintage. There was this warm feeling in my chest, this sense of pride that I was about to do something meaningful for my family. I had no idea that in less than an hour, that feeling would twist into something I still have trouble describing. The first mistake was deciding to rush. Elliot had texted that practice was ending early, which meant he would be home in 20 minutes instead of 45. I wanted everything to be ready when he walked through the door, wanted him to see me as capable and in charge. So instead of taking my time with the prep work, like Mom always emphasized, I started cutting corners. I grabbed the vegetables and began chopping them quickly, not bothering to wash the cutting board that had been sitting in the dish rack. The chicken went onto the counter without me checking if the surface was properly clean. I was moving fast, too fast, pulling out utensils and bowls and ingredients in a chaotic dance that would have made my mother cringe. The wok was heating on the stove, oil already starting to shimmer, and I still had half the prep work left to do. That frantic energy, that need to impress clouded every sensible thought in my head. I should have slowed down. I should have remembered that cooking is about patience, not speed. The glass measuring cup had been in our kitchen for as long as I could remember. It was one of those old Pyrex ones with the red measurement lines, the kind that feels indestructible until suddenly it is not. I needed to measure out the soy sauce and rice vinegar for the sauce, and I grabbed it from the cabinet without really looking. When I set it down on the counter a little too hard, I heard this sound. Not a crack exactly, more like a quiet ping, the kind of noise you almost convince yourself you imagined. I glanced at the cup and did not see anything obvious, no visible fracture or chip. So I poured in the soy sauce, then the vinegar, then the sesame oil, swirling it all together. It was only when I lifted the cup to pour the mixture into a small bowl that I noticed it. A thin sliver of glass, maybe half an inch long, sitting at the bottom of the dark liquid. My heart stuttered. I fished it out with my fingers, cutting my thumb slightly in the process, and stared at this tiny transparent shard that had almost made it into the sauce. Almost. But then a horrible thought crept in. What if there were more pieces that I could not see? I held the bowl up to the light, tilting it back and forth, searching for any glint or sparkle that might betray another fragment hiding in the dark liquid. The sauce was nearly black from the soy sauce, impossible to see through clearly. I told myself it was fine, that I had found the only piece, that glass does not just shatter into invisible dust. But my hands were not steady as I set the bowl down. The logical thing to do would have been to throw out the sauce and start over. We had more soy sauce, more vinegar, more of everything I needed. It would have taken 5 extra minutes, maybe less. But Elliot was going to be home any second, and Quinn would come downstairs expecting food, and I had already wasted time. The sauce looked fine. It smelled fine. I had removed the piece I found. In that moment, standing alone in the kitchen with the wok hissing behind me, I made a decision that I would regret for a very long time. I decided to use the sauce anyway. The cooking itself went smoothly, almost mockingly so. The chicken sizzled perfectly when it hit the hot oil, turning golden brown in all the right places. The vegetables kept their crunch, their colors bright and appealing. When I poured the sauce over everything, it coated each piece beautifully, filling the kitchen with that familiar garlic and ginger smell that always made our house feel like home. I heard the front door open just as I was transferring everything to the big serving bowl, and Elliot's voice called out asking what smelled so good. Quinn came padding down the stairs a minute later, actually taking out her earbuds for once, drawn by the aroma. They both stood in the kitchen doorway looking impressed, and I felt this surge of pride that almost drowned out the gnawing anxiety in my gut. I served them each a plate, rice on one side, stir-fry piled high on the other. We sat down at the kitchen table together, and as I watched my brother and sister raise their forks, something cold and sharp settled in my chest. What had I done? Every single bite they took felt like a countdown to disaster. Elliot was shoveling food into his mouth the way 13-year-old boys do, barely chewing, talking between bites about some kid on his team who could not make a free throw to save his life. Quinn ate more slowly, scrolling through her phone with one hand, but she was still eating, still swallowing pieces of chicken and vegetables that might contain microscopic shards of glass. I pushed my own food around the plate, unable to bring myself to actually eat any of it. My appetite had vanished completely, replaced by this sick, twisting feeling that made my stomach clench every time I heard one of them chew. I kept waiting for something to happen. A sudden yelp of pain, a hand flying to a mouth, blood. The rational part of my brain kept insisting that everything was fine, that I was overreacting, that one tiny chip from a measuring cup could not possibly have contaminated an entire batch of sauce. But the other part, the part that would not shut up, kept reminding me that glass can slice through soft tissue like butter, that internal cuts can cause bleeding you cannot see until it is too late. Elliot asked me why I was not eating, and I had to come up with a lie on the spot. I told him I had been snacking while cooking and was not that hungry, which he accepted without question. Quinn did not even look up from her phone. They had no idea, no clue at all, that I was sitting there watching them like a hawk, scanning their faces for any sign of distress. Every time Elliot paused mid-chew, my heart lurched. Every time Quinn took a sip of water, I wondered if she was trying to wash down something sharp that had scraped her throat. The minutes stretched out like hours, each one filled with this unbearable tension that I could not release. I wanted to tell them to stop, to push their plates away, to spit out whatever was in their mouths. But how could I explain? How could I admit that I had been careless, that I had put speed and pride above their safety? The shame of it pressed down on me like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe. So I sat there in silence, smiling when they complimented the food, dying a little inside with every word of praise. The meal ended without incident, but my nightmare was far from over. Elliot finished first, scraping his plate clean and asking if there was more. I told him no, that I had only made enough for one serving each, which was a lie. There was plenty left in the bowl on the counter. But I could not let him eat another bite. I could not let anyone eat another bite. Quinn finished a few minutes later and carried her plate to the sink, thanking me in that distracted way she had before heading back upstairs. Elliot flopped onto the couch and turned on the TV, completely oblivious to the war raging inside my head. I started cleaning up, moving mechanically, rinsing dishes and wiping counters while my mind spiraled through worst-case scenarios. I kept thinking about those medical shows my mom watched, the ones where patients came in with mysterious internal bleeding that nobody could explain. I thought about how glass fragments could lodge in the stomach lining, in the intestines, slicing slowly from the inside. Every medical horror story I had ever heard came flooding back, each one more terrifying than the last. I threw away the leftover stir-fry, all of it. I scraped the serving bowl into the trash and buried it under paper towels so nobody would see. The measuring cup went into the garbage too, wrapped in newspaper so the broken edge would not cut through the bag. I was destroying evidence, I realized, like some kind of criminal covering their tracks. But what else could I do? If I told the truth now, after they had already eaten, it would only cause panic without changing anything. The damage, if there was any damage, was already done. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom saying they would be home around 9:30, asking how dinner went. I typed back that everything was great, that the stir-fry turned out perfect, that Elliot and Quinn loved it. Each word felt like a betrayal. I was lying to everyone now. My siblings, my parents, myself. And the worst part was that I could not stop, because stopping meant admitting what I had done, and admitting what I had done meant facing the possibility that I had hurt the people I loved most in the world. The hours that followed were the longest of my life. I sat in the living room with Elliot, pretending to watch whatever show he had put on, but my eyes kept drifting to him every few seconds. I was watching for signs. A hand pressed to his stomach, a wince of discomfort, anything that might indicate something was wrong inside him. He seemed fine, laughing at the screen, completely relaxed. Upstairs, Quinn was quiet in her room, which was normal for her, but tonight every silence felt ominous. I made excuses to walk past her door, listening for any sounds of distress. Around 8:30, Elliot complained that his stomach felt weird, and I nearly came apart right there on the couch. I asked him what kind of weird, trying to keep my voice steady, and he shrugged and said he probably just ate too fast. Then he burped loudly and laughed about it, and the moment passed, But for those few seconds, I had been absolutely certain that this was it, that the glass had done its damage, that I was about to watch my little brother collapse in pain because of my stupid, selfish decision to cut corners. My parents came home just after 9, tired but cheerful, asking about dinner and praising me for stepping up. Mom hugged me and said she was proud, that this was a big step toward independence. Dad ruffled my hair and joked that maybe I could take over cooking duties permanently. I smiled and accepted their praise, feeling like the worst person alive. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound from Elliot's room next door, any indication that something was wrong. I kept my phone clutched in my hand, ready to call for help at the first sign of trouble. The guilt was suffocating, this thick black weight pressing down on my chest, making every breath feel earned. I had gambled with my family's safety because I was too embarrassed to admit a mistake, too proud to start over, too eager to impress. And now all I could do was wait and hope that I had not destroyed everything with one careless, cowardly choice. The next morning came slowly, gray light creeping through my blinds after what felt like an eternity of darkness. I heard Elliot's alarm go off through the wall, heard him shuffle to the bathroom, heard the toilet flush and the faucet run. Normal sounds. Living sounds. I got up and found Quinn already in the kitchen, pouring cereal, looking exactly the same as she always did on a Saturday morning. Elliot came downstairs a few minutes later, complaining about having to go to an early practice, but otherwise completely fine. No pain, no blood, no emergency. I watched them both eat breakfast, searching their faces one more time for any hint of suffering, and found nothing. The relief that washed over me was so intense I had to grip the counter to stay upright. They were okay. Somehow, impossibly, they were okay. The glass must not have made it into the food, or maybe there had only been that one piece after all. I would never know for certain, and that uncertainty would stay with me for a long time. But in that moment, standing in the morning light of our kitchen, I made a promise to myself. Never again would I let pride or embarrassment push me into a decision that could hurt someone I loved. I never told my family what happened that night. Part of me still thinks I should have, that they deserve to know the risk I put them in, even if nothing came of it. But the moment passed, and days turned into weeks, and eventually it felt too late to bring it up. What I did do was change. I became almost obsessive about kitchen safety after that, checking equipment before using it, taking my time with prep work, never rushing no matter how much pressure I felt. My mom noticed and commented once that I had become quite the careful cook. I just smiled and said I was trying to do things right. She had no idea how much weight those words carried. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that Friday evening. I think about how close I came to causing real harm, how a split-second decision to stay quiet could have ended with my brother or sister in a hospital bed. The fear has faded now, mostly, but the lesson remains burned into my memory like a scar. Some mistakes you can take back, others you carry forever, even when you get lucky enough to walk away without consequences. Finding affordable housing in Denver had become my personal nightmare long before I met the person who would turn my actual life into one. My graduating class from college in 2015 had scattered across the country chasing careers, But I stayed behind working retail management at a sporting goods store, watching rent prices climb every single year while my paycheck stayed flat. By the spring of 2023, my landlord announced he was selling the duplex where I had lived for 4 years, and suddenly I had 60 days to find somewhere new. Every apartment I toured wanted first month, last month, security deposit, and proof of income at 3 times the rent. My savings account had maybe $2,000 in it. My parents lived in Arizona on a fixed income and could not help. I started looking at shared housing situations out of pure desperation, scrolling through listings late at night after closing shifts, hoping to find something that would not drain every dollar I earned. The ad for the house on Sycamore Drive seemed almost too good. A 3-bedroom place where one tenant had just moved out, leaving a furnished room available for $600 a month, utilities included. The current resident was a guy named Darren Whitfield, who described himself as quiet, clean, and respectful of boundaries. I messaged him on a Saturday morning and he responded within minutes, inviting me to come see the place that afternoon. When I pulled up, the house looked decent enough from the outside. A small single-story with beige siding, a chain-link fence around a patchy yard. Nothing fancy, but nothing falling apart either. Darren answered the door wearing khaki pants and a plain blue polo shirt, his brown hair neatly combed, his handshake firm but not aggressive. He spoke softly, almost too softly, and I remember leaning in slightly to hear him as he showed me around the kitchen and living room. Everything was tidy. He asked about my job, nodded politely at my answers, and mentioned he worked remotely doing data entry for an insurance company. When I asked about a background check or lease agreement, he waved his hand and said the landlord was pretty relaxed about that stuff, just needed rent on the first of each month in cash or Venmo. I should have asked more questions. I should have demanded paperwork. But $600 a month with utilities and a move-in date of next week. I signed nothing, shook his hand, and told him I would bring my stuff over the following Friday. The first 2 weeks were fine, even pleasant. Darren kept to himself mostly, spending long hours in his room with the door closed, and when we crossed paths in the kitchen or hallway, he would give me a small nod or ask how my day went in that same quiet voice. I started to think I had lucked out. My bedroom was small but comfortable, with a window that looked out onto the backyard and a lock on the door that actually worked. I bought a mini fridge so I would not have to share the main one, set up my laptop on the desk Darren had left in the room, and started to settle into a routine. Work, home, dinner, sleep, repeat. Sometimes I would hear Darren talking in his room late at night, and I assumed he was on the phone with family or maybe playing some kind of online game with voice chat. The walls were thin enough that I could hear the murmur of his voice but not the actual words. It did not bother me. I wore earplugs to sleep anyway because of traffic noise from the main road 2 blocks over. Everything seemed normal, and I remember texting my friend Corinne that I had finally caught a break on the housing situation. The first strange thing happened on a Wednesday night about 3 weeks after I moved in. I came home from a closing shift around 11, exhausted and looking forward to crashing immediately, and found the back door standing wide open. Not just unlocked, fully open. The screen door pushed out against its hinges, letting in the cool night air and a few moths that had gathered around the porch light. I walked through the house calling for Darren, but his bedroom door was closed and no sound came from inside. I shut and locked the back door, checked the windows, and stood in the kitchen for a long moment trying to figure out what had happened. When I knocked on Darren's door to ask if he had left it open, he answered after almost a full minute, his hair messy like he had been sleeping, blinking at me with this confused expression. He said he had been in his room since 7 and had not touched the back door. His voice was calm, almost too calm, like he was reciting something he had rehearsed. I told myself that maybe I had not locked it properly when I left that morning, that the wind could have pushed it open, that there had to be a reasonable explanation. I went to bed but kept my own door locked, and I did not sleep well that night, listening for sounds in the hallway that never came. After that night, I started paying closer attention to things around the house, and that is when I began noticing details that I had previously overlooked or dismissed. My toothbrush would be in a different spot on the bathroom counter than where I had left it. A jacket I always hung on the back of my desk chair ended up draped across my bed. One morning I found my wallet sitting on the kitchen table even though I distinctly remembered leaving it on my nightstand before falling asleep. Small things, the kind of stuff you can easily convince yourself you imagined or forgot about. But they kept happening, 2 or 3 times a week, and each time I felt this creeping sensation that someone had been in my space while I was gone or asleep. I bought a cheap doorstop from a hardware store and started jamming it under my bedroom door at night in addition to locking it. I also started taking photos of how I left things before work, my desk, my dresser, the position of items on my shelf, so I could compare when I got home. The photos confirmed what I suspected. Things were being moved. Not dramatically, not obviously, just enough that I could tell. When I brought it up to Darren over dinner one evening, asking if he had been in my room for any reason, he looked at me with this blank expression and said no. Why would he go in my room? That would be a violation of my privacy. The way he said the word violation made something tighten in my chest. The late night talking from Darren's room got worse around the same time. What I had assumed was phone calls or gaming turned into something else entirely. I would wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning to the sound of his voice rising and falling through the wall. Sometimes calm and measured, sometimes sharp and angry, but always just one voice. No pauses for someone else to respond on a phone. No notification sounds or ringtones. Just Darren speaking in complete sentences to nobody I could hear, sometimes for an hour or more. One night I pressed my ear against the wall separating our rooms and listened, trying to make out the words. Most of it was too muffled, but I caught fragments. Something about being watched. Something about trust. A name I did not recognize repeated over and over. Then suddenly the talking stopped mid-sentence, and I heard footsteps cross his room toward the wall where I was listening. I pulled back and held my breath. The footsteps stopped. Neither of us moved. After what felt like 5 minutes but was probably 30 seconds, I heard him walk back to his bed, and the springs creaked as he lay down. I did not sleep the rest of that night. I just sat on my bed with the lights off, watching my door, wondering what kind of person I had moved in with and why I was still there. The strangers started showing up in early June. The first one came on a Sunday afternoon while I was doing laundry in the garage. I heard the doorbell, then voices in the living room, and when I came inside I found Darren talking to a heavy-set man in a stained gray hoodie who I had never seen before. They both went silent when I walked in. Darren introduced him as an old friend from high school, but the man did not offer his name or shake my hand, just stared at me with these flat, empty eyes until I excused myself and went back to my room. He was gone an hour later, and Darren never mentioned him again. Over the following weeks there were others. A woman with bleached blonde hair and scabs on her arms who arrived at midnight and left before sunrise. A skinny kid who could not have been older than 19, pacing on the front porch and smoking cigarettes until Darren let him in. An older guy with a neck tattoo, who showed up 3 different times and always went straight to Darren's room with a backpack that looked full when he arrived and empty when he left. I never learned any of their names. I never saw money exchange hands, but I knew what I was probably looking at, and it terrified me to think about what Darren might be involved in, what might be happening in the room next to mine, while I tried to pretend everything was fine. I should have left. I know that now, and I knew it then, but every time I opened my laptop to search for new apartments, I saw the same impossible numbers that had driven me to Sycamore Drive in the first place. First month, last month, security deposit, application fees, credit checks. My savings had not grown since moving in. If anything, unexpected car repairs and a root canal had drained them further. I calculated what it would take to move into even the cheapest studio apartment in Denver, and came up short by at least $800. My credit score was not great after some mistakes in my early 20s, which meant most landlords would reject my application anyway. I thought about asking Corinne if I could crash on her couch, but she lived in a 1-bedroom with her boyfriend, and I could not impose on them like that. I thought about calling my parents, but the shame of admitting I had made such a stupid decision, moving in with a stranger without any paperwork or background check, kept me from picking up the phone. So I stayed. I told myself I would save aggressively for 2 months, build up enough cushion to get out, and in the meantime I would just keep my head down and avoid Darren as much as possible. I installed a security camera app on an old phone and positioned it on my bookshelf facing my door, set to record whenever it detected motion. I bought a heavy-duty lock for my bedroom door and installed it myself one afternoon while Darren was out. I thought these precautions would be enough. I thought I could manage the situation until I had the money to escape. I was wrong about that too. The night everything changed started like any other Friday. I came home from work around 9, heated up leftover Chinese food, and went straight to my room to avoid any interaction with Darren. I could hear him moving around the kitchen, cabinets opening and closing, the faucet running, normal domestic sounds that should have been comforting but now made me tense. Around 11, I turned off my lights and got into bed, wedging the doorstop under the door, and checking that my phone was charged in case I needed to call for help. I fell asleep faster than usual, exhausted from a brutal week of inventory at the store. What woke me was not a sound but a sensation, a change in the air, a presence, something primitive in my brain screaming that I was not alone. I opened my eyes, and in the thin light bleeding through my curtains, I saw my bedroom door standing open. The doorstop was on the floor 3 feet away. The heavy-duty lock I had installed myself, the one that required a key from the outside, was hanging loose from the frame, the screws ripped out of the wood, and standing in my doorway perfectly still was Darren. He was just watching me. Not moving, not speaking, just standing there in boxer shorts and a white undershirt, his arms hanging limp at his sides, his face completely expressionless in the shadows. I do not know how long he had been there before I woke up. I do not know what he had been doing or planning to do. I sat up and said his name, trying to keep my voice steady, and he tilted his head slightly like a dog hearing a strange noise. Then he turned and walked back down the hallway to his room without a single word. I did not go back to sleep. I sat in my bed with every light on, my phone in my hand, my thumb hovering over the emergency call button, waiting for something else to happen. When the sun came up, I packed a bag with everything important: laptop, documents, medications, a few changes of clothes, and left it by my window in case I needed to escape quickly. I knew I should call the police, but what would I even say? My roommate stood in my doorway. He had not touched me, had not threatened me verbally, had not taken anything. I could already imagine the dispatcher's voice, polite but dismissive, telling me there was nothing they could do about a weird roommate. So instead, I called in sick to work and spent the day at a coffee shop, researching my options. Tenant rights, restraining orders, emergency shelters, anything that might help me get out. The information blurred together on my screen. Most resources assumed you had a lease, which I did not. Most advice assumed you had somewhere else to go, which I did not. I texted Corinne and told her something was wrong with my living situation, without giving details. She offered to let me stay for a night or two if things got really bad, but I could hear the hesitation in her voice even through text. I told her I would figure it out. I told myself the same thing. Around 6 in the evening, I drove back to Sycamore Drive because I had nowhere else to go, and because all my stuff was still there, and because some stubborn part of me refused to believe that the quiet, polite man who had shown me around the house 2 months earlier could actually be dangerous. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed a car I did not recognize parked on the street in front of the house. A beat-up red sedan with tinted windows and a cracked taillight. The front door was unlocked when I tried it, which was unusual because Darren was obsessive about keeping it locked during the day. I stepped inside and heard voices coming from the kitchen, loud and agitated, multiple people talking over each other. I should have turned around right then. I should have gotten back in my car and driven to Corinne's place and never looked back. But my bag was still in my room by the window, and my laptop had all my work files, and I convinced myself I could just slip down the hallway and grab my things without anyone noticing. I made it about 5 steps before Darren appeared at the end of the hall. blocking my path to my bedroom. Behind him I could see two men I had never met before, one of them holding what looked like a small handgun down by his thigh. Darren's face was different now, not blank or confused, but sharp, focused. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my legs feel weak. He asked me where I had been all day. He asked me if I had talked to anyone about him. He asked me what I had told Corinne in my text messages. The fact that he knew her name, that he had been reading my messages somehow, sent a wave of nausea through my stomach. I told him I was just grabbing some things and leaving for good, that I would not cause any trouble, that I did not care what he was doing and would never tell anyone. He stared at me for a long moment, then stepped aside and gestured toward my room. I walked past him on shaking legs, feeling his eyes on my back the whole way. I grabbed my bag from beside the window and stuffed a few more things inside. Chargers, my passport, a framed photo of my parents that I could not leave behind. My hands were clumsy and slow, fumbling with zippers that suddenly seemed impossible to operate. I could hear Darren and the two men talking in low voices in the kitchen, occasional words drifting down the hall. Money, shipment, problem, deal with it. I did not want to know what they were discussing. I just wanted to get out alive. I slung the bag over my shoulder, took one last look at the room that had been my home for 2 months, and walked back down the hallway toward the front door. Darren was waiting there, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, watching me approach. When I reached for the door handle, he put his hand on my arm, not hard, but firm enough to stop me. He leaned close and spoke directly into my ear, his breath warm against my skin, and said that if I ever mentioned this house or his name or anything I had seen to anyone, he would find me. He said he knew where my parents lived in Arizona. He said he had copied all the contacts from my phone one night while I slept. Then he let go of my arm, opened the door for me like a gentleman, and wished me luck finding a new place. I walked to my car without looking back. I drove to Corinne's apartment and sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I could stop shaking enough to go inside. I never went back to Sycamore Drive. I never reported Darren to the police because I was terrified of what he might do if I did. I stayed on Corinne's couch for 3 weeks until I found a room in a house with 2 women who insisted on background checks and a formal lease and references from previous landlords. I paid the extra fees gladly. I filled out every form they asked for. And sometimes late at night when I cannot sleep, I think about the other people who might have answered Darren's ad after I left, who might have seen that cheap rent and that tidy house and that soft-spoken man and made the same desperate choice I did. I hope they were smarter than me. I hope they asked the questions I did not ask. But mostly I just hope they got out too. Co-workers used to joke that I walked faster than anyone they knew. Born and raised in Chicago, class of 2014, you learn to move through the city with purpose, or you become an easy target. That Tuesday night in September 2023, I had stayed late finishing inventory at the bookstore where I worked as assistant manager. The L would have been the smart choice, but the apartment was only a 20-minute walk from the shop. And after 8 hours surrounded by fluorescent lights and dusty shelves, I wanted the night air. The streets in Lincoln Park are generally safe, well lit for the most part, full of young professionals walking their dogs and couples heading home from dinner. I had made this walk hundreds of times without incident. I grabbed the jacket, locked the front door, and started down the familiar route I could have navigated blindfolded. The first 10 minutes were completely unremarkable. I passed the Thai place on the corner that always smelled like lemongrass, nodded at the bartender smoking outside Murphy's pub, watched a group of college kids stumble out of an Uber laughing about something on one of their phones. Normal Tuesday night stuff. The temperature had dropped since afternoon, and I pulled the jacket tighter, thinking about the leftover pasta waiting in the fridge and the new episode of that true crime podcast everyone at work kept recommending. I turned onto Waverly Street, a quieter stretch lined with brownstones and old oak trees. Halfway down the block, I noticed a man sitting alone on one of the wooden benches near the small community garden. He appeared to be in his 50s, wearing a dark green jacket and khaki pants, hunched forward with his face illuminated by the glow of a phone screen. I made a mental note of him the way you do when you are a woman walking alone at night, then shifted the path slightly toward the curb to give him space as I passed. "Excuse me, miss?" His voice was polite, almost apologetic. I kept walking, pretending not to hear, which is the standard protocol drilled into every woman since childhood. Do not engage. Do not stop. Keep moving. But then he added, "Please, I just need help with something on this phone. The screen is too dark and these old eyes cannot make out the letters." I slowed down against every instinct screaming at me to continue. He sounded frustrated, helpless even, like someone's grandfather struggling with technology. I glanced back and saw him squinting at the device, holding it at arm's length the way older people do when they cannot find their reading glasses. The streetlight above him was flickering weakly, casting his face in intermittent shadow. Against all the rules I had internalized over the years, I felt a pang of guilt for ignoring him. What if he genuinely needed directions? What if there was an emergency and he could not read an important message? I stopped about 8 feet away from the bench, keeping what felt like a safe distance. "What do you need help with?" The words left my mouth before I could reconsider. He looked up with an expression of genuine relief, smile lines crinkling around his eyes. He had a weathered face, the kind that suggested years of outdoor work, and gray hair cropped short beneath a faded baseball cap. "Oh, thank you so much," he said, gesturing at the phone. "This thing keeps asking me to verify something and I cannot read what it says. The font is so small these days, you know. Everything is designed for young people with perfect vision." He let out a small laugh that seemed self-deprecating and harmless. I took a few steps closer, still maintaining some distance, craning my neck to see the screen from where I stood. The phone displayed some kind of login page with tiny text. "It says, 'Enter your verification code,'" I told him. "There should be a text message with a number." "A text message?" He frowned at the screen, then started scrolling slowly with his index finger. "How do I get to those? Is that the little envelope icon?" He angled the phone toward me, and I found myself leaning in slightly to get a better look. "No, that one there," I said, pointing without thinking. "The green one with the white bubble." He fumbled with the screen, tapping the wrong app twice before finally opening messages. The whole interaction felt painfully slow, the way helping a parent or grandparent navigate a smartphone always does. Part of me wanted to just grab the phone and do it myself, but I kept that boundary intact. He scrolled through what appeared to be a nearly empty inbox, squinting and bringing the screen closer to his face. "I think it might be this one," he muttered. "Can you see the numbers? There are too many of them and I cannot tell which ones to type in." He shifted on the bench, moving toward the edge closest to me, shrinking the gap between us by another foot or two. Something in the air changed then, though I could not have explained what. Maybe it was how smoothly he had repositioned himself, or how his questions kept requiring me to look more closely at the screen rather than at the surroundings. I became suddenly aware of how quiet Waverly Street had gotten. The brownstones on either side were dark, their residents already asleep or watching television in back rooms. No cars had passed in at least 2 minutes. The Thai restaurant and Murphy's pub felt very far away now, separated from me by several blocks and one poorly lit stretch of sidewalk. I took a small step backward, ready to give him a quick answer and continue on my way. "The code is 647321, I said, reading it off quickly. "Just type those numbers into the box and hit the green button." I was about to wish him a good night when I heard footsteps behind me. Not approaching from the distance, not walking past on the street. Close, right there, like someone had been standing still and just now decided to move. I turned my head and saw a second figure standing maybe 6 feet away, positioned directly between me and the main road I had come from. A woman, or what I initially thought was a woman, wearing an oversized hoodie with the hood pulled up and dark jeans that blended into the shadows. The face beneath the hood was young, maybe early 20s, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that held no expression whatsoever. She was not looking at the man on the bench. She was looking at me, studying me the way you might examine produce at a grocery store, deciding if it was worth taking home. There was no pretense of coincidence, no fake surprise at finding another person on this quiet street. She had clearly emerged from the narrow alley between two brownstones, an alley I had walked past without a second glance. The realization hit me like ice water down the spine. She had been waiting there, in the dark, watching the entire interaction unfold, waiting for the exact moment when the man on the bench had my full attention, when I was distracted and vulnerable and perfectly positioned with my back to the only escape route. The man on the bench stood up slowly. The helpless grandfather routine evaporated like morning fog, replaced by something deliberate and controlled. He slipped the phone into his jacket pocket without looking at it, those same eyes that had seemed friendly moments ago now flat and calculating. He was taller than I expected, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that his hunched posture had concealed. "You should not walk alone this late," he said, and his voice had changed too. Deeper, steadier, no more fumbling uncertainty. The woman in the hoodie took a step closer, not rushing, just calmly reducing the distance. I was caught in a shrinking triangle, the bench at my back, the woman blocking the path to the main street, and a wall of hedges from the community garden cutting off any lateral escape. Every self-defense class I had ever taken, every article I had read about trusting your instincts, every warning from friends and family about being careful at night, all of it screamed the same thing. This was planned. This was coordinated. And I had walked directly into it because I felt guilty about ignoring a stranger. The next few seconds stretched into something elastic and surreal. The man took a step toward me, and the woman mirrored his movement from the opposite direction. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them rushed. They moved with the patience of people who had done this before, who knew that panic makes victims freeze or run in predictable patterns. I felt the scream building in my throat but forced it down, knowing that a scream on this empty street might not bring help fast enough. Instead, I did the only thing my body would allow. I ran directly at the hedge. It was a wild, desperate calculation. The bushes were thick but not impenetrable, maybe 4 feet tall, bordering the community garden that I knew opened onto Addison Avenue on the other side. I heard the woman curse behind me as I crashed into the branches, thorns tearing at my jacket and scratching my face, my hands pushing through leaves and woody stems with strength I did not know I possessed. Something grabbed at my ankle, fingers or a branch. I could not tell, but I kicked backward hard and felt it release. I tumbled through the other side of the hedge and landed on my hands and knees in the soft dirt of the garden. Tomato cages and bean trellises surrounded me like skeletal sentinels in the darkness. I scrambled upright and ran between the raised beds, knocking over a wheelbarrow with a crash that echoed through the night. Behind me, I heard them pushing through the hedge, slower than I had been, maybe hesitant to follow into an open space with multiple exits. I did not look back. I reached the chain-link fence on the far side, climbed it in 3 desperate movements that left my palms bleeding from the wire, and dropped onto the sidewalk of Addison Avenue. A car was coming, headlights bright in the darkness, and I ran directly into the street waving my arms like a person possessed. The driver slammed on the brakes, horn blaring, and I was already at the passenger window pounding on the glass before the car fully stopped. Middle-aged woman stared at me with wide, frightened eyes. "Please," I said, and my voice came out cracked and breathless. "Please, there are people chasing me. Call 911, please." The woman, whose name I later learned was Candace, did not hesitate. She unlocked the doors and told me to get in while she dialed emergency services with shaking fingers. I collapsed into the passenger seat and locked the door immediately, my chest heaving, blood dripping from the scratches on my face onto her beige upholstery. Through the windshield, I watched the entrance to the community garden, expecting to see 2 figures emerge at any moment. But the seconds ticked by and no one appeared. They had vanished back into the shadows of Waverly Street, swallowed by the same darkness that had hidden them in the first place. The police arrived within 7 minutes, 2 squad cars with lights flashing. and I gave my statement while sitting on the curb wrapped in a shock blanket that one of the officers had retrieved from his trunk. I described the man in detail, the green jacket, the baseball cap, the weathered face. I described the woman in the hoodie, her sharp cheekbones, her empty stare. The officers exchanged glances when I mentioned the coordination between them, the way they had positioned themselves to cut off my escape. "Sounds like a team," one of them said quietly to his partner, as if this was something they had heard before. The detectives who contacted me the following week told me I was lucky. They had been tracking a pattern of similar incidents in the area over the past several months, always targeting women walking alone at night, always using the same technique of distraction and encirclement. 2 other victims had not been as fortunate as me. They would not give me details, and I did not ask for them. I moved to a different neighborhood before the month ended, broke my lease, and paid the penalty without complaint. For a long time afterward, I could not walk anywhere after sunset without my heart racing, and my eyes scanning every bench, every alley, every shadow that seemed too still. I take ride shares now, even for short distances. I do not care about the cost. Sometimes I think about that moment when I stopped walking, when I let guilt override every survival instinct I had ever developed. How close I came to becoming another statistic, another name in a police file, another cautionary tale told to women who just want to walk home in peace. The man with the phone is still out there somewhere, I assume, sitting on another bench in another quiet neighborhood, waiting for another woman to make the same mistake I almost made. And that thought keeps me awake more nights than I would like to admit. A stretch of empty highway late at night isn't usually where people expect anything meaningful to happen, but for me, it had become a second home. At that time in my life, I was juggling long shifts with the roadside assistance company while trying to save enough to move into a place that wasn't a shared basement apartment. Nights were quieter, paid a little better, and honestly gave me space to think. So when my work phone buzzed with a service request around 1:40 a.m., I didn't hesitate. The location was a long, forgotten segment of highway about 40 minutes from town. No streetlights, barely any signage, the kind of place where the darkness presses against the windows. I didn't bother calling dispatch to say I was heading out. I just grabbed the keys, threw on my jacket, and told myself it would be a quick tire change or a dead battery, nothing more. The road swallowed my headlights as I drove, and the temperature outside kept dipping lower than the forecast said it would. I remember noticing that the asphalt looked almost wet, even though it hadn't rained, like it was holding on to the cold. About 10 minutes from the pin on the GPS, I spotted a dim red glow on the shoulder, hazard lights pulsing weakly. At first, I didn't see anyone standing outside the vehicle, which struck me as strange given how cold it was. When I slowed down and rolled to a stop behind the car, 2 shapes finally came into view. One person leaning against the passenger side door, and another standing just a little too close to them. The man nearest the car had on a light denim jacket and kept one hand tucked into the pocket in a way that didn't match the weather. The driver, a woman maybe in her early 30s, held herself unnaturally still, like she was waiting for permission to speak. Stepping out of my truck, I called out a quick greeting, trying to sound casual. The man answered before the driver even lifted her head. He introduced himself as someone who just stopped to help and insisted everything was under control. His voice had this forced cheerfulness that didn't match his expression. His jaw was clenched tight, and he kept his eyes on me as if calculating something. The driver finally looked up, but only for a second, and it was the briefest glance, just enough for me to notice the way her hand twitched near her thigh. When the man shifted his stance, she made the smallest motion behind his back, a quick flick of her fingers toward me, almost like she was signaling without wanting him to see. It was so subtle I almost doubted I'd seen it. Trying to assess the situation, I walked closer and asked the driver if she'd requested assistance. The man answered again, louder this time, saying she had a flat tire and he was just about to take care of it. The woman didn't contradict him, but her shoulders tightened, and she pressed her lips together like she was bracing for something. Up close, I noticed her keys were still in the ignition, engine running, heat barely on. People with car trouble don't usually leave their engines running with strangers around. When I crouched near the back to check the tire, she made another tiny gesture. 2 quick taps against her leg, then a slow shake of her head. I felt a wave of unease that was hard to put into words. The kind that comes when your instincts start yelling long before your brain catches up. I stood up slowly, realizing I might have walked into something far more dangerous than a routine service call. I needed to buy myself a little time without tipping him off, so I pretended to focus on the tire, even though it was obvious the problem wasn't mechanical. The lug nuts looked untouched, and there were no punctures or bulges, nothing that would have triggered a service call. When I stood up again, the man had moved closer, not enough to seem aggressive, but enough to let me know he was tracking every move I made. He kept his feet angled toward me, like he was ready to cut off whatever direction I might choose. The woman kept her gaze lowered, but every so often her eyes flicked up toward me with this desperate urgency, the kind you recognize instantly, even if no one says a word. It hit me then that coming out here alone without notifying dispatch had been a real mistake, one I couldn't undo now. I asked the man directly how long he'd been there, hoping to read his reaction. His answer came too fast, like he'd rehearsed it. "Just a few minutes," he said, though the condensation on his jacket sleeve suggested otherwise. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "She seemed nervous out here by herself." His eyes didn't match the tone he was trying to use. They were sharp, alert, watching for any shift in my posture. The woman swallowed hard and adjusted her coat with tiny, shaky movements. I could see a set of shallow scratches on her left wrist, thin and recent. When the man noticed me looking, he slid subtly to block my line of sight. That was the moment I stopped pretending this was anything normal. I stepped toward my truck under the excuse of grabbing tools, hoping to discreetly hit the emergency button on my radio. But halfway there, I heard gravel shift behind me. He'd followed, staying just close enough to make sure he could see what I was doing. My truck's cab light flicked on when I opened the door, and that seemed to agitate him. His voice dropped, no friendliness left in it, and he said, "No need for all that, I told you. We've got everything handled." That phrasing made it clear he wasn't talking about the car anymore. I kept my body angled so I could see him through the corner of my vision, trying to act like I was simply sorting through equipment. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to be careful, to not escalate anything unless I had no choice. Before I could figure out my next move, the woman spoke for the first time. Her voice was thin but steady, like she'd finally decided the risk of staying silent was worse than whatever might happen if she pushed back. "Could you please check the trunk?" she asked me, emphasizing the words in a way that didn't fit the question. The man whipped his head toward her, surprise breaking through whatever mask he'd been holding on to. That brief reaction told me everything. She wasn't asking about a spare tire. She was trying to carve out an opportunity, any opportunity, for one of us to break whatever hold he had on the situation. My pulse hammered as I realized every second I hesitated was another second she stayed trapped beside someone who clearly wasn't there to help her. The trunk request gave me a narrow opening, so I nodded and walked toward the back of the car. The man hesitated before following, and that hesitation alone told me he didn't want me near it. The woman stepped slightly to the side, positioning herself closer to my truck than before, like she was aligning her escape route in advance. As I reached the trunk, I deliberately slowed down, pretending to fumble with the latch while angling my body so I could see both of them in the reflection of the rear window. The man hovered behind me, too close again, arms stiff at his sides. "There's nothing back there," he insisted, but there was a sharpness to his voice now, a raw edge that replaced his earlier forced calm. I lifted the trunk anyway, even though I expected resistance. To my surprise, he allowed it, but his jaw tightened like he was waiting for a reason to intervene. Inside the trunk, everything was too clean. No tools, no luggage, not even a spare tire. A total empty shell except for a single bright blue windbreaker folded neatly in the corner. Most people driving that late at night have something back there. Jumper cables, old blankets, grocery bags, anything. The emptiness itself felt wrong. When I turned back toward the woman, she made a small motion with her elbow toward the man, almost like she was trying to tell me without words that the danger wasn't in the trunk at all. It was the person standing beside her. Her breathing had shifted, quiet but uneven, like she was trying to hold herself together. That was when I realized she'd positioned herself just a few steps from my truck's passenger door. She was calculating too. The man suddenly stepped between us and slammed the trunk shut with more force than necessary. "I told you, there's nothing there," he said, tone sharper now. The hollow thud echoed across the empty highway. He squared his shoulders toward me, and there was no attempt at friendliness left, no pretense. His eyes were locked on mine, and the tension rolling off him felt heavy enough to cut through the cold night air. I made sure my hands stayed visible and raised them slightly, not in surrender, but in a way that signaled I wasn't looking for trouble. Behind him, the woman shifted her weight from one foot to the other, ready for a cue, either from me or from whatever unpredictable move he might make next. I knew I had one shot to get both of us out of there without something irreversible happening. My radio wasn't an option with him shadowing my every move, and my phone was buried in my jacket, so I spoke clearly, forcing a steadiness into my voice I wasn't fully feeling. "I need to run a quick verification with the service log," I said. "Company requirement." It was a lie, one he didn't know enough about my job to challenge immediately. Before he could respond, I called out to the woman, "Can you hand me your ID real quick?" Emphasizing hand me in a way I hoped she'd catch. She reacted instantly, stepping toward my truck instead of toward me. The man realized what was happening half a second too late and lunged, not at her, but at me, as if stopping me was the only thing that mattered. That split second became the only window she needed. She yanked open my truck's passenger door and dove inside, slamming it shut just as the man's shoulder collided with mine. The impact wasn't enough to knock me over, but it forced me a step back, and that tiny bit of space became my advantage. I didn't swing or shove him. I just moved out of his reach, putting the length of the truck between us. He rounded the front like he planned to block her in, but she was faster. I heard the click of the lock button, and then the metallic thud of her sliding across the seat to grab the driver's side latch from inside. I threw myself toward the door before he could reach it, and by pure luck we pulled at opposite sides of the handle at the same time. The door cracked open just wide enough for me to wedge my shoulder in and slip into the cab. She shoved my keys into my hand with this urgent determination, like she'd been waiting for this exact moment. The man grabbed the doorframe before I could pull it shut, his fingers hooking over the metal. His face was inches from the gap, expression stripped down to something cold and deliberate. He didn't say a word, not a threat, not a demand, just stared at us like we'd interrupted something he fully intended to finish. I turned the key in the ignition with one hand and used my other forearm to force the door inward, pinning his fingers between the frame and the hinge. He jerked back with a sharp grunt, and that was the only break we needed. I slammed the door shut, threw the truck into drive, and hit the gas so hard the tires skidded before catching traction. The woman pressed herself against the seat, breathing hard, her eyes darting back toward the shrinking figure on the roadside as the headlights stretched his shadow across the asphalt. We didn't speak for a full minute. The highway ahead felt endless, the kind of straight dark road where distance has no meaning. Her hands were clenched around the fabric of that bright blue windbreaker from the trunk, a detail I hadn't even seen her grab. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled only on the first word. She told me she'd pulled over because her engine light came on, and the man had arrived almost immediately, too quickly to be coincidence. He'd insisted on helping, then taken her keys straight from the ignition before she could react. Every attempt she made to step away from him had been met with a firmer tone, a closer stance, a quiet pressure that kept her from running. She hadn't known what he wanted, only that he wasn't letting her leave. Her gestures toward me were the only signals she thought she could risk. I drove her straight to the nearest gas station with lights and security cameras, not stopping until we were in a place that felt safe enough for both of us to breathe normally again. From there, she called a relative to pick her up. I stayed with her until they arrived, then reported everything to dispatch and the county sheriff. When officers checked the location an hour later, Neither the man nor her car was there. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing except a small patch of disturbed gravel where we'd struggled at the door. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he planned to do, and I still think about the fact that I almost showed up too late. But one thing became crystal clear that night. Instincts aren't guesses, they're warnings, and ignoring them on a deserted highway in the middle of the night could have ended in a way neither of us could come back from. That night has stayed with me in a way I never expected, maybe because life felt so steady back then. I was living alone for the first time in a small apartment near a row of old brick buildings, where the hallways always carried this faint smell of dust and warm paper, like an old library that never quite aired out. I'd been juggling work, errands, and the occasional swipe through a dating app just to remind myself I wasn't turning into a hermit. That's where I met a guy named Evan. At least that was the name he used. His profile showed him outdoors a lot, usually with a baseball cap and a big grin, the kind that made him look approachable without trying too hard. We chatted for a few days, nothing deep, but enough that meeting him didn't feel reckless at the time. He pushed a bit harder than I expected when it came to picking me up. I suggested meeting at the cafe, but he replied right away saying he'd rather take care of the driving, adding a winking emoji that I tried to interpret as playful, not controlling. I hesitated, fingers hovering above my phone, but eventually agreed because I didn't want to come across as paranoid. When he pulled up, the car was spotless in a way that didn't match the slightly messy vibe he'd given off online. He stepped out wearing a dark green jacket with scuffed elbows and greeted me with a laugh that came out too loud for the quiet street, like he'd practiced sounding relaxed and overshot the landing. Still, dinner itself was fine. Not great, not terrible. He talked a lot, mostly about his job in consulting, though every time I asked what exactly that meant, he changed the angle of the conversation. When we got back to my building, he parked and immediately got out, saying he'd walk me to my door. I thanked him, but said it wasn't necessary. It wasn't even late, and I lived in a pretty safe area. The shift in his face was instant, like someone clicking a switch behind his eyes. He didn't argue, just nodded once with this stiff clipped motion and got back into the car. He didn't wave, didn't say goodnight, just pulled away with this slow, crawling roll that made me stand there pretending to check my purse so I wouldn't have to watch him drive off. Inside my apartment, I tried to shake it off by making tea and watching something dumb on my laptop, but the whole interaction kept replaying in my head, especially the way he shut down the second I declined his offer. A few hours later, I opened the app again out of curiosity, maybe to reassure myself I hadn't imagined the weirdness. His profile was gone, not unmatched, not blocked, but vanished completely. The more I thought about his pictures, the more details stopped lining up. One photo that looked like a campsite suddenly seemed like a stock image. The hiking picture had a backdrop I'd swear I'd seen online before. Even the age he listed didn't match the tiny lines I'd noticed near his eyes in the restaurant. It felt like realizing I'd gone on a date with a cardboard cutout, something shaped like a person but hollow once you looked too close. At the time, it just left me unsettled, nothing more. I couldn't have guessed the night still had one last turn waiting for me. Later that night, the building was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that makes every small noise stand out like it's being amplified. I couldn't sleep, so I left the living room lamp on and curled up on the couch scrolling through mindless videos just to distract myself. Every so often, the pipes in the wall let out these metallic pops, normal for the building, but they kept making me glance toward the hallway that led to my front door. Around midnight, something made me get up and walk to the peephole. It wasn't a noise exactly, more like the sense that the quiet had changed shape. When I looked through, the hallway was empty, but there was a faint shadow stretching across the floor, as if someone stood just outside the narrow field of view. I blinked hard, stepped back, and then leaned in again, but the shadow stayed, unmoving. My first instinct was to rationalize it. Maybe the light in the hallway was flickering, or maybe there was something leaning against the opposite wall casting that shape. I stood there arguing with myself in whispers, telling my brain to stop jumping to conclusions, but my body wouldn't move away from the door. Then I noticed something else. The air felt warmer near the peephole, like someone on the other side was standing close enough for their body heat to bleed through the wood. I rested my palm against the door for just a second and felt a faint vibration, rhythmic and subtle, like breathing. That's when the realization sank in that whoever or whatever was out there wasn't just passing through. They were waiting. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes locked on the door. My apartment wasn't big, but suddenly it felt too open, with every lamp casting long, strange shadows across the walls. I reached for my phone, debating whether I should call someone, my friend Marina maybe, or even the building's security desk. But the idea of saying it out loud made me feel ridiculous. I hadn't seen a face. I hadn't heard footsteps, just a shadow and warmth. I kept trying to convince myself I was overreacting to a bad date and a worse vibe. Still, I turned off the TV and stood in silence, listening to every creak of the old building like it was a message. That's when the doorknob moved. It didn't rattle or jerk like in movies. It rotated slowly, deliberate enough that I heard each tiny shift of metal, like someone testing it with patience. Like they already knew I lived alone and wanted to see if I'd forgotten to lock the deadbolt. I felt my breath catch, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, instinctive way, like my body was bracing for something it didn't want to name. I took 2 steps back, then 3, gripping my phone so tightly my fingers tingled. The knob never turned all the way, but it moved just enough to prove that what I'd felt wasn't imagination. Someone was standing at my door, trying to get in as calmly as if they had all night to try. The sound stopped as suddenly as it began, but the silence that followed felt heavier than before, almost like it had weight to it. I kept staring at the door, expecting the knob to turn again, but nothing happened. I waited a full minute before tiptoeing back toward the peephole, moving slowly enough that the floorboards wouldn't betray me. When I pressed my eye against the tiny glass, the hallway looked normal again. Empty still, lit by that tired yellow bulb overhead. But the shadow I'd seen earlier wasn't there anymore. The air around the door didn't feel warm either. Everything looked so plain that I started wondering if my mind had stitched the whole thing together out of leftover anxiety from the date. I almost convinced myself of that, right up until I noticed the faintest echo of a shoe print right at the edge of my doormat, like someone had been shifting their weight back and forth while waiting. I backed away from the door and sat on the floor with my knees pulled up, trying to steady myself. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? Hi, a man I went on one mediocre date with might be lurking outside my home, except I can't prove it? It sounded absurd. And yet the unease rising through me didn't feel absurd. It felt precise, like every instinct I had was pointing toward the same conclusion. I wasn't imagining anything. I checked the windows next, drawing the curtains tighter even though I lived on the 3rd floor and no one could reach them from outside. Then, I turned off the lamp in the living room, leaving only the soft glow from the kitchen nightlight. The dimness made shadows pool in the corners, but I felt less exposed with the lights low. I tried lying down on the couch, thinking sleep might take the edge off, but every sound made my eyes snap open. A distant elevator ding, the creak of another tenant's door. Even the hum of the refrigerator sounded sharper. Sometime around 1:30 I heard soft footsteps in the hallway, slow, evenly spaced, like someone pacing rather than heading toward a specific unit. They paused near my door, paused long enough that I covered my mouth with both hands to keep my breathing quiet. Then the steps continued a few paces and stopped again, right near the stairwell. Whoever it was didn't go down the stairs or toward the elevator. They just stood there, listening, waiting. The presence felt intentional, like I was the only reason they were lingering on my floor at all. I stayed frozen on the couch until the footsteps eventually faded, but I didn't dare check the peephole again. My phone battery hovered at 12%, and I kept it clutched in my hand just in case. Every scenario I could think of flashed through my mind, each one worse than the last. I kept replaying the shift in Evan's face when I refused to let him walk me to my door. The stiffness in his posture, the sudden quiet, the way he pulled away without a single word. All those strange gaps in his stories at dinner had felt mildly annoying at the time. Now they stacked together like mismatched puzzle pieces, forming a picture I didn't want to look at directly. Whoever he really was, he hadn't disappeared from that app because he got bored. Something about the timing made my skin prickle in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. By the time 3 a.m. crawled around, exhaustion started pulling at me, but I was too keyed up to close my eyes for more than a few seconds. I decided to sit at the small dining table facing the door, telling myself that keeping the door in sight would make me feel more in control. It didn't. Every so often a faint thud came from somewhere in the building, pipes settling, a neighbor shifting in bed. Normal stuff. But in my head each noise stretched into something deliberate. I kept thinking about how close he'd been earlier, close enough for his breath to warm the wood. The thought settled under my ribs like a weight. I kept rehearsing what I'd do if he tried the doorknob again, but every version of the plan fell apart somewhere in the middle. Around sunrise, the hallway finally brightened as the motion-sensitive lights flicked to a cooler white. I hesitated for a good 10 minutes before checking the peephole again. This time, the hallway was completely clear, no shadows, no stray noises, nothing suggesting someone had been standing there hours earlier trying to slip inside. A tiny part of me wondered if I'd overreacted after all, until I noticed a small piece of folded paper tucked under the corner of my door. My stomach tightened immediately. I stared at it through the peephole for so long that my vision blurred. When I finally cracked the door open just enough to pull it inside, the hallway remained silent. The paper wasn't a note, not exactly, just a printed screenshot of a map with a blue pin dropped over my building. No message, no handwriting, just that. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't change clothes. I just grabbed my keys and left the apartment, locking everything behind me with shaking fingers. I drove straight to a coworker's place across town, someone I trusted enough not to question me when I showed up pale and wide-eyed on her doorstep. We sat in her tiny kitchen while I told her everything, every detail I could remember about the date, the hallway, the doorknob. She listened quietly, then insisted I call the police. I did, and the officer who came later that morning walked through my apartment, checked the hallway camera, and took a statement. The camera had a blind spot right by my door, just a few inches where someone could stand without being seen. The officer said they'd look into it, but I could tell by his tone he thought I'd just had a frightening night and nothing more. I didn't go back to that apartment for 3 days. When I finally did, I brought 2 friends with me. Nothing had been disturbed. No more papers under the door, no strange sounds. But that screenshot sat heavy in my thoughts. It was too intentional, too pointed to be random. I ended my lease 2 months early and moved to a different building across the river, someplace with brighter hallways and cameras that didn't leave blind spots. I changed numbers, deleted the dating app, and spent weeks wondering how much of the person I'd met was even real. What scared me most wasn't that he'd lied about his photos or his job. It was that he'd wanted to walk me to my door. He wanted to know exactly where I lived. Looking back now, I still don't know what would have happened if I hadn't locked the deadbolt that night. Maybe nothing. Or maybe everything that kept me awake afterward, the footsteps, the warmth at the door, the map, would have led somewhere much darker. All I know is that the moment that doorknob turned, something in me changed permanently. I trust my instincts now, even when they don't make sense to anyone else. Especially then. Whatever he was planning, it stopped at that locked door. And that's enough closure for me, even if the rest of it never makes sense.